双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
Dead Souls. Part 1. Chapter 1. To the door of an inn in the provincial town of N, there drew up a smart britchka, light spring carriage of the sort affected by bachelors, retired lieutenant colonels, staff captains, landowners possessed of about 100 souls, and, in short, all persons who rank as gentlemen of the intermediate category. In the britchka was seated such a gentleman, a man who, though not handsome, was not ill-favored, not over-fat, and not over-thin. Also, though not over-elderly, he was not over-young. His arrival produced no stir in the town, and was accompanied by no particular incident, beyond that a couple of peasants who happened to be standing at the door of a dram shop exchanged a few comments with reference to the equipage rather than to the individual who was seated in it. "Look at that carriage," one of them said to the other. "Think you it will be going as far as Moscow?" "I think it will," replied his companion. "But not as far as Kazan."
No.
Not as far as Kazan. With that the conversation ended. Presently, as the britchka was approaching the inn, it was met by a young man in a pair of very short, very tight breeches of white dimity, a quasi-fashionable frock coat, and a dickey fastened with a pistol-shaped bronze tie-pin. The young man turned his head as he passed the britchka and eyed it attentively, after which he clapped his hand to his cap, which was in danger of being removed by the wind, and resumed his way. On the vehicle reaching the inn door, its occupant found standing there to welcome him the polavoy, or waiter, of the establishment, an individual of such nimble and brisk movement that even to distinguish the character of his face was impossible. Running out with a napkin in one hand, and his lanky form clad in a tailcoat, reaching almost to the nape of his neck, he tossed back his locks, and escorted the gentleman upstairs, along a wooden gallery, and so to the bedchamber which God had prepared for the gentleman's reception. The said bedchamber was of quite ordinary appearance, since the inn belonged to the species to be found in all provincial towns, the species wherein, for 2 rubles a day, travelers may obtain a room swarming with black beetles, and communicating by a doorway with the apartment adjoining. True, the doorway may be blocked up with a wardrobe, yet behind it, in all probability, there will be standing a silent, motionless neighbor whose ears are burning to learn every possible detail concerning the latest arrival. The inn's exterior corresponded with its interior. Long, and consisting only of 2 stories, the building had its lower half destitute of stucco, with the result that the dark red bricks, originally more or less dingy, had grown yet dingier under the influence of atmospheric changes. As for the upper half of the building, it was, of course, painted the usual tint of unfading yellow. Within, on the ground floor, there stood a number of benches heaped with horse collars, rope, and sheepskins, while the window seat accommodated a spitenchick one, cheek by jowl with a samovar, too, the latter so closely resembling the former in appearance that, but for the fact of the samovar possessing a pitch-black lip, the samovar and the spitenchick might have been 2 of a pair. 1. An urn for brewing honey tea. 2. An urn for brewing ordinary tea. During the traveler's inspection of his room, his luggage was brought into the apartment. First came a portmanteau of white leather whose raggedness indicated that the receptacle had made several previous journeys. The bearers of the same were the gentleman's coachman, Cellophane, a little man in a large overcoat, and the gentleman's valet, Petrushka, the latter a fellow of about 30, clad in a worn, over-ample jacket which formerly had graced his master's shoulders, and possessed of a nose and a pair of lips whose coarseness communicated to his face rather a sullen expression. Behind the portmanteau came a small dispatch box of redwood, lined with birch bark, a bootcase, and, wrapped in blue paper, a roast fowl, all of which having been deposited, the coachman departed to look after his horses, and the valet to establish himself in the little dark anteroom or kennel where already he had stored a cloak, a bag full of livery, and his own peculiar smell, pressing the narrow bedstead back against the wall. He covered it with a tiny remnant of mattresse remnant, as thin and flat, perhaps also as greasy, as a pancake which he had managed to beg of the landlord of the establishment. While the attendants had been thus setting things straight, the gentleman had repaired to the common parlor. The appearance of common parlors of the kind is known to everyone who travels. Always they have varnished walls, which, grown black in their upper portions with tobacco smoke,
are,
in their lower, grown shiny with the friction of customers' backs, more especially with that of the backs of such local tradesmen as, on market days, make it their regular practice to resort to the local hostelry for a glass of tea. Also, parlors of this kind invariably contain smutty ceilings, an equally smutty chandelier, a number of pendant shades which jump and rattle whenever the waiter scurries across the shabby oilcloth with a trayful of glasses, the glasses looking like a flock of birds roosting by the seashore, and a selection of oil paintings. In short, there are certain objects which one sees in every inn. In the present case, the only outstanding feature of the room was the fact that in one of the paintings a nymph was portrayed as possessing breasts of a size such as the reader can never in his life have beheld. A similar caricaturing of nature is to be noted in the historical pictures of unknown origin, period, and creation, which reach us sometimes through the instrumentality of Russian magnates who profess to be connoisseurs of art from Italy, owing to the said magnates having made such purchases solely on the advice of the couriers who have escorted them. To resume, however, our traveler removed his cap, and divested his neck of a party-colored woolen scarf of the kind which a wife makes for her husband with her own hands, while accompanying the gift with interminable injunctions as to how best such a garment ought to be folded. True, bachelors also wear similar gauds, but, in their case, God alone knows who may have manufactured the articles. For my part, I cannot endure them. Having unfolded the scarf, the gentleman ordered dinner, and whilst the various dishes were being got ready, cabbage soup, a pie several weeks old, a dish of marrow and peas, a dish of sausages and cabbage, a roast fowl, some salted cucumber, and the sweet tart which stands perpetually ready for use in such establishments. Whilst, I say, these things were either being warmed up or brought in cold, the gentleman induced the waiter to retail certain fragments of tittle-tattle concerning the late landlord of the hostelry, the amount of income which the hostelry produced, and the character of its present proprietor. To the last mentioned inquiry the waiter returned the answer invariably given in such cases, namely, "My master is a terribly hard man,
sir."
Curious that in enlightened Russia so many people cannot even take a meal at an inn without chattering to the attendant and making free with him. Nevertheless, not all the questions which the gentleman asked were aimless ones, for he inquired who was governor of the town, who president of the local council, and who public prosecutor. In short, he omitted no single official of note, while asking also, though with an air of detachment, the most exact particulars concerning the landowners of the neighborhood. Which of them, he inquired, possessed serfs,
And how many of them?
How far from the town did those landowners reside? What was the character of each landowner? And was he in the habit of paying frequent visits to the town? The gentleman also made searching inquiries concerning the hygienic condition of the countryside. Was there, he asked, much sickness about, whether sporadic fever, fatal forms of ague, smallpox, or what not?
Yet,
though his solicitude concerning these matters showed more than ordinary curiosity, his bearing retained its gravity unimpaired, and from time to time he blew his nose with portentous fervor.
indeed,
The manner in which he accomplished this latter feat was marvelous in the extreme, for, though that member emitted sounds equal to those of a trumpet in intensity, he could yet, with his accompanying air of guileless dignity, evoke the waiter's undivided respect so much, so that, whenever the sounds of the nose reached that menial seer's, he would shake back his locks, straighten himself into a posture of marked solicitude, and inquire afresh, with head slightly inclined, whether the gentleman happened to require anything further. After dinner the guest consumed a cup of coffee, and then, seating himself upon the sofa, with, behind him, one of those wool-covered cushions which, in Russian taverns, resemble nothing so much as a cobblestone or a brick, fell to snoring, whereafter, returning with a start to consciousness, he ordered himself to be conducted to his room, flung himself at full length upon the bed, and once more slept soundly for a couple of hours, aroused, eventually, by the waiter. He, at the latter's request, inscribed a fragment of paper with his name, his surname, and his rank for communication, in accordance with the law, to the police, and, on that paper the waiter, leaning forward from the corridor, read, syllable by syllable, Paul Ivanovich Chichikov, collegiate counselor landowner traveling on private affairs. The waiter had just time to accomplish this feat before Paul Ivanovich Chichikov set forth to inspect the town. Apparently the place succeeded in satisfying him, and, to tell the truth, it was at least up to the usual standard of our provincial capitals. Where the staring yellow of stone edifices did not greet his eye, he found himself confronted with the more modest gray of wooden ones, which, consisting, for the most part, of 1 or 2 stories, added to the range of attics which provincial architects love so well, looked almost lost amid the expanses of street and intervening medleys of broken or half-finished partition walls. At other points evidence of more life and movement was to be seen, and here the houses stood crowded together and displayed dilapidated, rain-blurred signboards whereon boots of cakes or pairs of blue breeches inscribed Arshavsky, tailor, and so forth, were depicted. Over a shop containing hats and caps was written Vasily Theodorov, foreigner, while, at another spot, a signboard portrayed a billiard table and 2 players, the latter clad in frock coats of the kind usually affected by actors whose part it is to enter the stage during the closing act of a piece. Even though, with arms sharply crooked and legs slightly bent, the said billiard players were taking the most careful aim, but succeeding only in making abortive strokes in the air. Each emporium of the sort had written over it, "This is the best establishment of its kind in the town." Also, al fresco in the streets there stood tables heaped with nuts, soap, and gingerbread, the latter but little distinguishable from the soap. And at an eating-house there was displayed the sign of a plump fish transfixed with a gaff. But the sign most frequently to be discerned was the insignia of the state, the double-headed eagle, now replaced, in this connection, with the laconic inscription Dram Shop. As for the paving of the town, it was uniformly bad. The gentleman peered also into the municipal gardens, which contained only a few sorry trees that were poorly selected, requiring to be propped with oil-painted, triangular green supports, and able to boast of a height no greater than that of an ordinary walking stick. Yet recently the local paper had said, apropos of a gala, that, thanks to the efforts of our civil governor, the town has become enriched with a pleasaunce full of umbrageous, spaciously branching trees. Even on the most sultry day they afford agreeable shade. And indeed gratifying was it to see the hearts of our citizens panting with an impulse of gratitude as their eyes shed tears in recognition of all that their governor has done for them. Next, after inquiring of a gendarme as to the best ways and means of finding the local council, the local law courts, and the local governor, should he, Chichikov, have need of them, the gentleman went on to inspect the river which ran through the town, en route he tore off a notice affixed to a post, in order that he might the more conveniently read it after his return to the inn. Also, he bestowed upon a lady of pleasant exterior who, escorted by a footman laden with a bundle, happened to be passing along a wooden sidewalk a prolonged stare. Lastly, he threw around him a comprehensive glance, as though to fix in his mind the general topography of the place, and betook himself home. There, gently aided by the waiter, he ascended the stairs to his bedroom, drank a glass of tea, and, seating himself at the table, called for a candle, which having been brought him, he produced from his pocket the notice, held it close to the flame, and conned its tenor, slightly contracting his right eye as he did so. Yet there was little in the notice to call for remark. All that it said was that shortly one of Kotzebue's 3 plays would be given, and that one of the parts in the play was to be taken by a certain Monsieur Poplevin, and another by a certain Mademoiselle Zyublova, while the remaining parts were to be filled by a number of less important personages. Nevertheless, the gentleman perused the notice with careful attention, and even jotted down the prices to be asked for seats for the performance. Also, he remarked that the bill had been printed in the press of the provincial government. Next, he turned over the paper, in order to see if anything further was to be read on the reverse side, but, finding nothing there, he refolded the document, placed it in the box which served him as a receptacle for odds and ends, and brought the day to a close with a portion of cold veal, a bottle of pickles, and a sound sleep. 3. A German dramatist, 1761 to 1819, who also filled sundry posts in the service of the Russian government. The following day, he devoted to paying calls upon the various municipal officials first, and a very respectful visit being paid to the governor. This personage turned out to resemble Chichikov himself in that he was neither fat nor thin. Also, he wore the riband of the Order of St. Anna about his neck, and was reported to have been recommended also for the Star. For the rest, he was large and good-natured, and had a habit of amusing himself with occasional spells of knitting. Next, Chichikov repaired to the vice-governors, and thence to the house of the public prosecutor, to that of the president of the local council, to that of the chief of police, to that of the commissioner of taxes, and to that of the local director of state factories. True, the task of remembering every bigwig in this world of ours is not a very easy one, but at least our visitor displayed the greatest activity in his work of paying calls, seeing that he went so far as to pay his respects also to the inspector of the municipal department of medicine and to the city architect. Thereafter he sat thoughtfully in his britchka, plunged in meditation on the subject of whom else it might be well to visit. However, not a single magnate had been neglected, and in conversation with his hosts he had contrived to flatter each separate one. For instance, to the governor he had hinted that a stranger, on arriving in the governor's province, would conceive that he had reached paradise. So velvety were the roads. Governors who appoint capable subordinates, had said Chichikov, are deserving of the most ample meed of praise. Again, to the chief of police our hero had passed a most gratifying remark on the subject of the local gendarmerie, while in his conversation with the vice-governor and the president of the local council, neither of whom had, as yet, risen above the rank of state councillor, he had twice been guilty of the gaucherie of addressing his interlocutors with the title of Your Excellency, a blunder which had not failed to delight them. In the result, the governor had invited him to a reception the same evening, and certain other officials had followed suit by inviting him, one of them to dinner, a second to a tea party, and so forth, and so forth. Of himself, however, the traveler had spoken little, or, if he had spoken at any length, he had done so in a general sort of way and with marked modesty. Indeed, at moments of the kind his discourse had assumed something of a literary vein, in that invariably he had stated that, being a worm of no account in the world, he was deserving of no consideration at the hands of his fellows, that in his time he had undergone many strange experiences, that subsequently he had suffered much in the cause of truth, that he had many enemies seeking his life, and that, being desirous of rest, he was now engaged in searching for a spot wherein to dwell. Wherefore, having stumbled upon the town in which he now found himself, he had considered it his bounden duty to evince his respect for the chief authorities of the place. This, and no more, was all that, for the moment, the town succeeded in learning about the new arrival. Naturally, he lost no time in presenting himself at the governor's evening party. First, however, his preparations for that function occupied a space of over 2 hours, and necessitated an attention to his toilet of a kind not commonly seen. That is to say, After a brief postprandial nap, he called for soap and water, and spent a considerable period in the task of scrubbing his cheeks, which, for the purpose, he supported from within with his tongue, and then of drying his full, round face, from the ears downwards, with a towel which he took from the waiter's shoulder. Twice he snorted into the waiter's countenance as he did this, and then he posted himself in front of the mirror, donned a false shirt front, plucked out a couple of hairs which were protruding from his nose, and appeared vested in a frock coat of bilberry-colored check. Thereafter, driving through broad streets sparsely lighted with lanterns, he arrived at the governor's residence to find it illuminated as for a ball. Barouches with gleaming lamps, a couple of gendarmes posted before the doors, a babel of postilions, cries nothing of a kind likely to be impressive was wanting, and, on reaching the salon, the visitor actually found himself obliged to close his eyes for a moment, so strong was the mingled sheen of lamps, candles, and feminine apparel. Everything seemed suffused with light, and everywhere, flitting and flashing, were to be seen black coats, even as on a hot summer's day flies revolve around a sugar loaf while the old housekeeper is cutting it into cubes before the open window, and the children of the house crowd around her to watch the movements of her rugged hands as those members ply the smoking pestle. And airy squadrons of flies, borne on the breeze, enter boldly, as though free of the house, and, taking advantage of the fact that the glare of the sunshine is troubling the old lady's sight, disperse themselves over broken and unbroken fragments alike, even though the lethargy induced by the opulence of summer and the rich shower of dainties to be encountered at every step has induced them to enter less for the purpose of eating than for that of showing themselves in public, of parading up and down the sugar loaf, of rubbing both their hindquarters and their fore against one another, of cleaning their bodies under the wings, of extending their forelegs over their heads and grooming themselves, and of flying out of the window again to return with other predatory squadrons.
Indeed.
So dazed was Chichikov that scarcely did he realize that the governor was taking him by the arm and presenting him to the governor's lady. Yet the newly arrived guest kept his head sufficiently to contrive to murmur some such compliment as might fittingly come from a middle-aged individual of a rank neither excessively high nor excessively low. Next, when couples had been formed for dancing, and the remainder of the company found itself pressed back against the walls, Chichikov folded his arms, and carefully scrutinized the dancers. Some of the ladies were dressed well and in the fashion, while the remainder were clad in such garments as God usually bestows upon a provincial town. Also here, as elsewhere, the men belonged to two separate and distinct categories, one of which comprised slender individuals who, flitting around the ladies, were scarcely to be distinguished from denizens of the metropolis. So carefully, so artistically, groomed were their whiskers, so presentable their oval, clean-shaven faces, so easy the manner of their dancing attendance upon their womenfolk, so glib their French conversation as they quizzed their female companions. As for the other category, it comprised individuals who,
stout,
or of the same build as Chichikov, that is to say, neither very portly nor very lean, backed and sidled away from the ladies, and kept peering hither and thither to see whether the governor's footmen had set out green tables for whist. Their features were full and plump, some of them had beards, and in no case was their hair curled or waved or arranged in what the French call the devil-may-care style. On the contrary, their heads were either close-cropped or brushed very smooth, and their faces were round and firm. This category represented the more respectable officials of the town. In passing, I may say that in business matters fat men always prove superior to their leaner brethren, which is probably the reason why the latter are mostly to be found in the political police, or acting as mere ciphers whose existence is a purely hopeless,
airy,
trivial one. Again, stout individuals never take a back seat, but always a front one, and, wheresoever it be, they sit firmly and with confidence, and decline to budge even though the seat crack and bend with their weight. For comeliness of exterior they care not a rap, and therefore a dress coat sits less easily on their figures than is the case with figures of leaner individuals. Yet invariably fat men amass the greater wealth. In 3 years' time a thin man will not have a single serf whom he has left unpledged. Whereas, well, pray look at a fat man's fortunes, and what will you see? First of all a suburban villa, and then a larger suburban villa, and then a villa close to a town, and lastly a country estate, which comprises every amenity. That is to say, having served both God and the state, the stout individual has won universal respect, and will end by retiring from business, reordering his mode of life, and becoming a Russian landowner, in other words, a fine gentleman who dispenses hospitality, lives in comfort and luxury.